The story begins with the protagonist wondering where he was because he had reincarnated in an unknown world with a mortal body. He explains that before he died he was a powerful emperor. By only raising his hand he could make the sky tremble. Also, he says in this world he's seeing a lot of unbelievable things. His world was very different from this one. For example, women do the hard work here and men, instead, take care of the house and of looking good. The scene changes and we see that the protagonist, before dying, fought with the venerable demon, a being very powerful. So much that when their two powers confronted each other they ended up destroying the infinite emptiness and losing their lives as consequence. It was a miracle that with the destruction of the emptiness his soul still managed to get into a world and find a dead body of someone who had just died so he could reincarnate on it. The bad of that world is that the spiritual energy is very low, so it's going to take a while for his soul to recover from the battle and in consequence, to get his powers back. The protagonist tells us that the old owner of that body is called Linmo. He wonders if the venerable demon had reincarnated just like he did. But anyway, until he gets his powers back he would have to live like Linmo, and according to the memories of that body his parents died when he was young and from that moment his grandmother took care of him. But now she was on the hospital because of the disease Alzheimer. Since he didn't have anyone else who could take care of him, his aunt non-related became his tutor. She and her family moved in with him and before he could realize it, everything he owned was now hers and all of his expenses reduced to one, misery. We see his aunt is called Liu Yingjun and her son Lin Xingxuan. They're talking and we see his aunt tells to Lim No that she's sorry for what happened at school with Ni Yanhui, and this one remembers that his grandmother, before her Alzheimer, had arranged a wedding with Ni Yanhui, a colleague of high school, but once she saw him she despised him because he was fat, calling the wedding off. It was then when the old owner of the body went through a hard time and ended up losing his soul on the street, knocked by a car by accident. The scene changes and now Lin Mo is at the school, amazed for the architecture of that new world. He also makes fun of the way the men of that world were dressed, and notices the women look normal. We're shown a blonde girl who's gonna be important later, so remember her. Once inside the school, Lin Mo goes straight to his sit on the classroom and then his classmate who sits next to him asks him for a favor. She asks if he can play a game with her and on exchange she'll introduce him to a girl even prettier than the one who rejected him. But since he wasn't interested on that, she invites him to go to the Mount Maju during the summer. She says she knows he couldn't go there by himself but that she had some contacts that could take him there. On that moment he remembers a rumor that says the highest mountains can have a lot of spiritual energy. But knowing he could lose his life trying to go there by himself on that body, he accepts that girl's offer and after their class they go to play that game she wanted. The girl asks him if he has a register number. Lim No says he does and then they transport themselves to the game. Once inside it he sees is a game about fairies and immortals. Sun Li, the girl, says she called her boss, a player of national level who's gonna give them some help. If there's any problem they would only have to hide behind her back. This is a game of 3 against 3. And the winner is determined for the number of deaths. The boss is going to play and asks them to stay behind her. We see the protagonist decides to go with her instead and he tells himself immortals are mystical beings on that world. After some minutes we see the boss had been killed. She comes back and decides to go there again, but she's killed again. It turns out they're not pretty good at that game, so they keep like that for some minutes. And we see now that the player who's killing them is the blonde girl we saw in the beginning. The protagonist starts running and that girl goes after him. He realizes he's being followed, so he turns and gets prepared to attack while he thinks he had never been hunted before since he became an emperor. The girl decides to avoid him and find an opening, so the protagonist thinks it's a play of punch and run, and that with his body he could never win. So he decides to temporarily use the power of his soul to stimulate the potential of his body. The girl takes advantage of his distraction and attacks him, but the protagonist saw that coming and prepared to counterattack. Fei Yu is killed by baby Momo. Everyone gets surprised because the protagonist managed to kill Fei Yu. Even his friend flatters him saying he's really good. But seeing he wasn't looking well she asks if he's okay and he says to himself he didn't know that to use a damaged soul to stimulate the potential of the body would cause such an important lesion to the physical body. The scene goes back to the game and we see Fei Yu is seeing our protagonist from far, wondering if he doesn't get tired for running so much. She decides to go kill him with more effort this time and he realizes this, so he starts attacking from far. She thinks he's crazy for doing so and trusts herself thinking she can dodge the attack, but to her surprise, one of the attacks impacts her leg. She wonders if that was a warning for her to stop following him. Meanwhile we see that her other colleagues have been killed, so they tell her they have lost. Then is revealed to us the real name of Fei Yu, Zhao Yudeng. She's very angry and asks her friend if she knew the guys of the other team and that she wanted to meet them later while she says to herself the name of baby Momo. Our protagonist. The scene changes again and we see the protagonist says goodbye to his friend and reminds her not to forget about her promise to take him to the mount. Once at home Lim No thinks about his body and how fragile this was. At the next day Lim No goes to school and his friend tells him Zhao Yuding wanted to see him, or, to be truth, she wanted to see baby Momo. But then Yan Hui abruptly interrupts the scene, coming to our protagonist Sid to tell him he must say to everyone their wedding was a farce. Lim No's friend, on an attempt to defend his friend, tells her to shut up and that she's going way too far. To that, this girl questions her why was she defending him so much and if it was because she liked him. Because of her face, we see she feels disgusted only thinking about it. The protagonist tells to Yanhui that nothing would ever happen between them, and she tells him that he could never say again he's gonna marry her. That only by hearing it she felt disgusted, and that she only went to his house to see his cousin. But then someone else interrupts the scene. We see Zhao Yuding getting on the classroom and how all the classmates are surprised by her beauty. She points to the protagonist Sid and says, "Baby Mono, come with me." The protagonist gets mad because he doesn't want to be called like that. His friend tells him the girl just wants to play a game with him and to please go with her. So he goes and Zhao Yuding asks him if he was indeed who had played with her, and he confirms it. She asks him why he was running so much, and he says he was doing it to reduce numbers. She gets mad with his answer and asks him to go see her after classes to play with him alone. The protagonist, as the male alpha he is, tells him he won't, that he only won for luck and that he have to go back to his class. She gets even angrier and tells her friend if that fatty doesn't know who she is. Once the class was finished, one of Zhao Yuding's friends goes find Lin Mo by her orders, but he's not anywhere, so she wonders where he could have gone. We see he'd gone Ito buy some food and after that left, thinking about how he wasn't used to that noisy world. So he decides to go to the rooftop where no one could bother him. The scene changes and we see this beautiful girl named Shinkai who's saying to someone that she'll be probably dead on 3 years, and that they were destined to share the same name and body, that if she goes with her she can make all her desires come true on the future. She agrees and tells herself that her 18 years will be hers too. Then she tells herself she's been 10,000 years training. And this is where it's revealed to us that this girl was actually the venerable demon who fought with the protagonist. She could finally defeat the emperor, but even so, she wasn't so happy after all. She felt empty and thought the only thing she could do on the future is to relive again until she reincarnated on the demon's world. She also reflexes about the emperor. He had a lot of tricks up his sleeve, so he couldn't just die like that. Maybe he had also reincarnated. It could even be on the same world she did. But her thoughts change their course and she thinks about her past life. She explains that on her world she could never get his father approval even though she had tried so hard, only for being a girl. She also mentions that men despised her there and only wanted her to defile her. But all of that changed when she wore the evil mask. She killed all of them and made them fear her. While she was saying that she thinks that his charm would attract men and that on this world she would try to be more compassionate. Suddenly their thoughts are interrupted. She sees the protagonist and feels like he's following her, so she turns to confront him, saying him it's impossible to have anything with her. But he walks through her and calls her sick, making her blush. The protagonist is directing to the rooftop when he sees that girl again behind him. He thinks she's following him but decides to keep walking anyway. It turns out the girl was just going to the rooftop like him, and when she realizes this decides to go to another place to be alone. But then she remembers that normal students don't usually go there, and when they do is always with a gang or something. She remembers that humans on that world weren't only weak physically but also mentally, and that they easily gave their lives away. So she wonders if he's going there to kill himself. She decides to stay away since she has nothing to do with it, but something inside her won't let her go. The best friend of the body's owner had also killed himself, so she feels the ex-owner wants her to save that guy. For this she decides to go to the rooftop, since she had promised to fulfill the ex-owner wishes, and once she passed the door, she sees the protagonist on the edge of the building and concludes that what she thought was true. She tries to use her spiritual energy to control him, but then she remembers she doesn't have that power on this world. We see how the protagonist says that it was very cold there and that once he's done eating he would go back. But then he hears the girl coming at him. She quickly takes him from his back to try to stop him for killing himself. Somehow she managed to carry him for a moment, but having such a weak body and being the guy so heavy, they ended up falling on the floor with the protagonist above her. He thinks about how careless he was since he didn't see her coming, and then he asks her what the hell was she doing. She answers she was about to ask the same. That if he really wanted to kill himself, and if it was the case he should go a desert to do it, where he wouldn't cause any trouble. He gives her a hand to help her get up while he says to her she has a big imagination, since he was there just to relax and not to kill himself. He clarifies he's not interested on her, making her blush again and get mad. She asks him to leave, saying she doesn't need his help. So he leaves and thinks that on the 1,000 years he was an emperor he had never held someone's hand. And also that the women on that world were very direct and spontaneous, so they would suddenly come up to you, silently, to hug you. The scene changes and we see the classes were over and that the protagonist is with his friend telling her he had to go now, but that she shouldn't forget to take him to that mount. When he was going he remembers the girl and says that he almost broke her ribs with when they fall, but he assumes she's okay. But then he remembers the human's body is very weak, so she was probably hurt. Since he didn't hurt any ambulance on the school, decides to go check on her if she's still there. We see on the rooftop that the girl is still there, complaining about that weak body and trying to get up even though she can't. She's very angry and cold but too proud to ask for any help. Being a demon, she'd rather die than ask for help. She thinks about how powerful she used to be, that only the emperor could hurt her, but now she lost on the hands of a fatty. Then she heard some steps and sees as the protagonist. She asks him why he was back and what he wanted. He touches her and confirms he had broken her ribs. He blames her for it, saying she was so weak because she didn't do any exercise. She says she probably does more exercise than a person who can smash the ribs of a girl, making fun of him, saying that it wouldn't happen if he was thinner. The protagonist ignores her and takes his coat out to put it on the girl since it's really cold up there. After that, he calls an ambulance, says to the girl that now they were on peace. The girl asks him to take his coat back and he answers he knows she doesn't want to use it because he's fat, but that her body was fragile so she should use it until the ambulance arrive. After that, she could throw it away or burn it. Minutes later, the ambulance arrives and they take the girl out of there, who's feeling very ashamed. She would never forget that. Linmo gets home and his cousin asks him to explain why Zhao Yudeng went look for him and what they talked about. The protagonist asks him to leave him alone, but this one insists, saying it wasn't possible she would look after him because she wanted, that he probably was in trouble. He demands him not to put their family on any trouble and threats him, saying that if he doesn't tell him what truly happened, he would go talk to his mother to kick him out of the house. The protagonist gets now mad and answers he's shameless. Since the house was his, the cousin gets violent and tries to punch him, but the protagonist stops him and realizes how weak is the one who's trying to punch him. He folds his hand, his arm, and puts him on the floor. Then, the cousin went look for his father, saying Linmo had punched him, so the father comes down and tries to punch Linmo, but this stops his blow and put his hand aside. They're interrupted by his aunt, who goes to the protagonist and tells him she doesn't care about what happened. The fault was his for punching them and orders him to apologize to them. He thinks to himself that this woman was probably the first one saying to an emperor to apologize, and answers that only who was guilty should apologize, and he wasn't. She thrills him, saying that if he didn't apologize she wouldn't give him any money for vacation. But he goes to his room saying he doesn't care. He starts looking for things he could sell to earn some money, but he doesn't find any. If he doesn't have money, he won't be able to go to the mount, he thinks. He has to find a way to earn some money. Leaving that aside, he decides to work on his body to get his strength back. The body is the base of the cultivation, and when he could finally absorb the spiritual energy, his body should be healthy. He decides to use the muscle technique of his past life, but after 3 minutes we see he's already tired. So he concludes that without the support of an aura he won't be able to train a body like that. At the next day, the protagonist was having breakfast when his cousin asks him why he was up so early and, making fun of him, asks if someone asked him out. Some minutes later we see the bus that will take them to the mountain had arrived, and at the same time we see that the cousin, who was going to the mountain with Yanhai, tells her they better leave quickly because he was scared of Linmo. Once on the bus, she asks him why he was so scared, and he says that is because of her. That after she broke up with him he turned against them and punched him and his father. She says that's deplorable and if he's okay. Everyone there says that thank God he won't be there, but the friend of Linmo lets them know that he's coming too. Everyone mocked him, saying he was so fat he couldn't even make it to the top of the mountain. The protagonist's friend says she didn't accept him to come, but since he would, he should be with her so he won't feel so lonely. She gives him her sit. Some minutes later, the protagonist sees that there's a girl on a motorcycle following them. This girl accelerates to go in front of the bus until she makes it stop. The driver tells her to see better where she's driving, and she takes her helmet out to show us she's Zhao Yudeng. She says she's there because of Linmo, so she goes talk to him and tells him not to go to the mountain but instead to go play with her, that if he does she will make his ex-girlfriend go back with him. But he rejects her and asks her not to bother him, and we see that everyone is shocked for his answer. He says he could play with her after climbing the mountain, while he thinks to himself he's going to try to find the cultivators of that world on the mountain. But minutes later we see they're playing on the way to the mountain, so Yudeng won. While they're playing, the protagonist stays away from her and she wonders what is he trying to do keeping such a distance. Linmo gets ready to kill her with one blow, and she, trusted, thinks it's impossible for him to punch her from such a distance and at that speed. But it ended up working. She was killed with only one blow. Victory for baby Momo. She's surprised for losing again and asks to Linmo why his blows are so precise. He answers that the game is made on a way that whoever who was a good aim, calculation and good luck could kill its enemy within seconds. Accepting her defeat, she asks what he wants for winning, and since he wouldn't let go that opportunity, he asks for $10,000. She says she can do it and offers to pay to him every month if he agrees to be his trainer and partner of games on the future, but he says that it isn't necessary. Yudeng keeps her side of the agreement and gives him the money, and since her phone number was on the register, she asks him not to call her or give her number to anyone. The protagonist thinks that he, as an emperor, it's not even half as arrogant as that girl. Some moments later we see they have finally arrived. Everyone see how high the mountain is and wonder how they'll manage to climb it. The women were who helped the men, so Sun calls everyone and announces they will begin to climb the mountain. 30 minutes later we see most of them are complaining because they're too exhausted to keep going, and seeing that Linmo laughs because he, with that body, was more resistant than them. He thinks once he gets his strength back he will make them suffer for ages. Then he keeps climbing. 20 minutes later Linmo admits he can't do it anymore since his resistance was the worst of all of them, and complains about them for being so pretentious. We see he can hardly climb anymore and his friend thinks she should help him, but he rejects her help and tells her she should climb at her own rhythm. He tries to convince himself that he can do it. That is nothing compared to all of the trials and tribulations he went through to become an emperor. His friend tells him that if he can't make it he should rest and that later they would go look for him. He agrees and minutes later we see that everyone have given up so they were coming down. His classmates were surprised when they saw he started climbing and had gone so far. Sun tells him that is enough, that he shouldn't keep climbing because the mountain was way too high. It was better for everyone to go eat at the restaurant and that she would invite them. But Linmo rejects the invitation and says he wants to see the view on the top of the mountain, so he kept going. 20 minutes later we see he could finally make it to the top of the mountain, and when Yuding sees him she's impressed and thinks that it's kind of sad how much he struggled to make it there by himself since his colleagues left him alone when he was too tired to continue, and once he decided to keep going everyone was already coming down, leaving him alone again, and also because they've been mocking him all day long. Linmo sees the view and feels some spiritual energy there, and even if it's not as much as he had when he was an emperor, it can be enough to start again. He says to himself he won to the venerable demon, and that he would train hard, no matter what it takes, to be on the top again. Meanwhile, Yuding asks him what he's doing, to what he answers he's admiring the view. Then she says she owns the place now so he should go down, but he says he's too tired to walk so he asks her to take him down. She says he's crazy and that she'll let him be free only for today. She gives him the leftovers of a sandwich and leaves, not before reminding him he'll be his partner starting tomorrow. Limno says he had eaten carcasses of beasts for his training when he was an emperor and that food is exactly what he needs now, so he eats it and after that he starts extracting spiritual energy from the mountain. Some hours later, it was already night. Sun calls Limno to tell him they're leaving but he says he won't go because that was a nice place so he wanted to stay all summer. Sun says that it's okay and that he could call him if he needed anything. Then Limno goes to reception and asks how much it costs a single room for 2 months. The receptionist says it'll cost 8,000 yens. He says he'll stay there for 2 months then. And this is how he started his training. He would go to the mountain to extract its energy and then he would work out on his body to get his strength back. After 2 months we see So is calling Limno to tell him she's almost there so he should get ready to go and he thanks her for picking him up. She answers it's okay. Now we see protagonist in front of the mirror looking at his new body. He says that even though he worked out for 2 months the energy of his body was still weak, so he would keep training to get stronger and meanwhile, he'll play the role of the mediocre student.